Matthew Rowell never imagined that retirement would pull him into a battle over land he legally owned and had spent years restoring with his own hands. After leaving his position in public infrastructure consulting, where he oversaw rural development projects across several counties, he didn't opt for luxury or leisure like many of his former colleagues. Instead, he purchased a piece of property on the edge of a growing suburban area, a parcel with a weathered barn, crumbling fencing, and a house that most modern buyers wouldn't even consider. For Matthew, though, the property wasn't about convenience or aesthetics. It was about independence, function, and the freedom to work on his own terms. The barn was old, built in the 1940s, originally used as part of a small dairy operation that folded sometime in the early 80s. The siding was faded, warped in places, but structurally sound. Matthew had no intention of converting it into some kind of rustic Airbnb or boutique hobby farm. He used it for what it was meant for: storage, work, and tools. He installed solar panels along its roof, repurposed rain collection systems along the sides, and set up a fully outfitted workshop inside, complete with a kiln, power tools, and mechanical equipment for metalwork and light fabrication. He didn't advertise what he was doing, nor did he invite neighbors over for barbecues or community potlucks. He kept to himself, paid his taxes, and maintained the land with the kind of thoroughness only someone with experience in regulations and land use would bother with. His property bordered a suburban development that had exploded in the past 5 years, the kind filled with neat little cul-de-sacs, HOA-mandated beige siding, and decorative mailboxes, all approved to match. While the residents inside that world lived according to newsletter notices and landscaping rules, Matthew's place stood in stark contrast just beyond the tree line. You couldn't see his barn from the main road, but you could hear it when the compressor kicked on, or when metal clanked on metal as he worked late into the evening. That difference, the visual, the audible, and most of all the ideological, was what drew attention. At first, the tension was subtle. He would get notes placed under the gate, polite, almost friendly, suggesting that perhaps he might consider trimming excess foliage or refraining from operating heavy machinery past sunset. Matthew ignored them. He wasn't part of their association. His land had been excluded from the neighborhood development by virtue of grandfathered zoning, and he'd verified it personally before purchasing the property. Still, the notes persisted. Then came the drone flyovers. Not frequent, just enough to be noticed. Once a week, sometimes less. Low sweeps that made no attempt to hide. He caught one on camera, followed it as it hovered, and later traced it to a real estate agent who claimed they were surveying adjacent parcels for visual continuity. That was the first red flag, and it didn't sit well with Matthew. He'd worked long enough in the planning sector to know the soft signs of overreach. It usually didn't start with lawsuits or bulldozers. It started with pressure. Pressure disguised as suggestions. Drones, letters, polite calls from people concerned about neighborhood cohesion. The second red flag came not long after when he received a manila envelope in the mail. No stamp, just hand-delivered and slid into the slot. Inside was a printed packet. Community Enrichment Proposal. Public Green Space Reclamation Initiative. Glossy photos showed a vision of a community garden and wellness path, complete with benches, wildflower beds, a walking loop, and a repurposed structure to serve as a gathering pavilion. That structure, in every single render, was his barn. Matthew read the entire packet, line by line. Nowhere did it mention his name or property directly, but the overhead site mock-ups left no doubt. His land, his barn, his hard-earned perimeter, they were all included in the proposal, like a done deal. The final page thanked the neighborhood committee for their support and enthusiasm, and noted that relevant landholder cooperation is expected based on the upcoming revised zoning recommendations. He stared at those words for a long time, then slid the packet into a drawer and locked it. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an idea in early planning stages. This was a move already in motion. Someone had presumed authority over what was his. He spent the next day reviewing his deed, checking boundary lines, confirming parcel numbers with the county. Everything checked out. His land was still sovereign, still beyond the reach of any residential board or neighborhood oversight. But legal accuracy didn't stop what came next. A week after receiving the packet, Matthew returned from a supply run to find plastic flags staked along the edge of his property, just a few feet into his land. They were the kind surveyors used, bright orange and blue markers with tape tied around stakes driven into the ground at 20-foot intervals. No notice had been given. No calls, no permission. When he called the number printed on one of the flags, he got a voicemail for a private contracting firm that claimed to be working on behalf of a local improvement initiative. He left a message telling them to remove the flags. The next morning, they were gone, but in their place was a thin wooden post hammered into the grass at the corner of his lot, with a laminated sign that read, "Future site of community garden. Access pending." He tore it down and burned it in his fire pit. The final straw came 3 days later. He was working in the barn, welding a custom bracket for a shelving unit, when he felt the deep vibration first, a low rumble that shook the frame of the barn slightly. He shut off the tools, pulled off the mask, and stepped outside. That's when he saw it. A yellow excavator crawling down the gravel service road that separated his property from the residential boundary. Behind it followed a flatbed truck loaded with landscaping materials, mulch, pallets, and what looked like irrigation lines. At the front of the small convoy walked a woman in a sun hat, clipboard in hand, talking animatedly to the driver. Matthew walked down to meet them, boots crunching against the gravel. As he approached, the woman turned and smiled. "You must be Mr. Rao," she said, as if greeting someone she knew personally. "We're just getting an early start, prepping the soil and clearing that derelict structure so we can get the new beds in before the rain." "Derelict structure?" he repeated. She pointed toward the barn. "It's scheduled for demo next Tuesday." "Didn't you get the packet?" "I own that building," Matthew said, his voice low but steady. "And this isn't a public access site. That's my land." Her smile faltered slightly, just for a second before she stepped back. "Well, that's a bit of a complication. We were told this space had been allocated for Phase 1 of the Green Initiative. Maybe there's been some delay in the paperwork." "There's been no paperwork, no permits, no agreements. You're trespassing." The driver cut the engine. Silence settled over the gravel road. Matthew looked at him, then at the crew in the flatbed truck. They stood still, uncertain, waiting for a cue. The woman checked her clipboard, then tapped on her phone, scrolling. "Look," she said after a moment, "we can come back later. Maybe there's been a miscommunication. I'll check with the board and get clarification." "You do that," Matthew said, not moving. She nodded and gestured for the team to turn back. The excavator reversed slowly, grinding over the gravel, and the truck followed suit. As they pulled away, Matthew remained standing there, hands at his sides, jaw locked tight. This wasn't a miscommunication. This was a quiet, calculated takeover. No court orders, no police. Just pressure, motion, and the expectation that no one would resist. But Matthew Rao wasn't going to give up his land. Not through neglect, not through intimidation, and certainly not because a smiling woman in a sun hat thought a garden looked better than a barn. Something had started here. Something deep. He felt it in the crawl of his nerves and the tightness in his shoulders. They weren't done. And now, neither was he. The morning after the unexpected visit from the excavator crew, Matthew sat at his kitchen table surrounded by a stack of documents. Land surveys, deed records, zoning maps, and correspondence from the county planning office he'd printed and highlighted over the last 6 hours. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, and the overhead light buzzed softly in the silence as he reviewed, again and again, the parcel number associated with his property. He wasn't just trying to reassure himself, he was trying to prepare for the next step, because there would be one. The moment the woman on the gravel road had turned back, Matthew knew it hadn't been the end of the issue. It had only been the testing phase. Someone somewhere was pushing to see how far they could go before he pushed back. It didn't matter how polite the approach or how sanitized the language in the printed materials was. The intent was clear, to wear him down by making it look inevitable. By noon, he had called the county recorder's office, the zoning commission, and the public works liaison. He introduced himself clearly, gave parcel numbers, and asked direct questions. Was there any pending change to the designation of his property? Had a neighborhood committee submitted any proposal involving his land? Were there any new easements, exceptions, or revisions under review? The answers were consistent. No, nothing had been filed. As far as the official records were concerned, his land was still fully private, agriculturally zoned, and exempt from residential association oversight. No new documentation had been submitted to alter that. Yet, there was activity happening as if the changes were already approved, and that disconnect wasn't just concerning, it was dangerous. Matthew's next call was to his attorney, Paul Hargrave, a land use specialist he had consulted during the property purchase years ago. Paul remembered him, and didn't sound surprised when Matthew outlined what had occurred. "It's not uncommon," Paul said, his voice dry, measured. "Committees and associations sometimes act like they have more authority than they do. They test boundaries, and if no one resists, they proceed as if resistance isn't allowed. The key is catching them early." Matthew explained the flags, the laminated sign, the incoming equipment, and the development packet. Paul asked for photos, which Matthew had already taken, and told him to scan and send everything he had. "I'll draft a cease and desist to issue if anyone returns," he added. "In the meantime, document everything. No confrontation. Just build a record." That night, Matthew drove the perimeter of his land with a spotlight and took pictures at every marker. He checked the trail cams he'd installed months earlier, originally just to keep track of wildlife. Now they were his best defense. One camera had picked up movement from the previous evening. 2 individuals walking the edge of his western lot line, one holding a measuring wheel, the other carrying what looked like a survey tablet. They weren't from the county. No uniforms, no vehicle plates visible. It wasn't professional. It was invasive. He clipped the footage and stored it on a drive. The following morning brought an even more brazen move. A notice had been taped to his gate, printed on letterhead from the local neighborhood council, signed not by a legal authority but by a community development coordinator named Karen Bell. The document was informal, but it read with an air of presumed authority. It stated that due to persistent resident concerns and a visionary green renewal proposal, the structure referred to as the outbuilding on parcel 191-B would be considered non-conforming, and that site preparation might involve limited access for assessment pending final review. The last paragraph warned against obstruction of communal planning efforts. Matthew stood at the gate, the paper in his hand, reading it 3 times before folding it once and sliding it into his pocket. Karen Bell. The name was familiar. He'd seen her walking the looped sidewalks in the adjacent neighborhood, always dressed with sharp precision, always watching more than she appeared to. She wasn't on any formal city board, but she was on the neighborhood committee's leadership team. And, more importantly, she was the kind of person who considered oversight a personal mission. Her signature on that notice didn't surprise him. It simply confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't a city-sanctioned project. It was a grassroots power grab, camouflaged in the language of improvement. Matthew didn't retaliate. Instead, he responded the way any intelligent, experienced man would, by setting traps. Not literal ones, but legal and digital. He forwarded the notice to Paul, who sent back a statement for Karen and her group. Any further action on or involving Parcel 191B would be treated as unlawful trespass, and Matthew was prepared to pursue civil damages if necessary. Then he called the utility company to confirm no pending requests had been submitted for access or disconnection. Finally, he submitted a request to the county to place a hold on any zoning change involving his land. It was a procedural move and temporary, but it forced any would-be developers to confront the fact that his parcel wasn't simply in play. A few days passed without a further incident, and he hoped briefly that the escalation had worked. But peace never lasts when the foundation is wrought. On Thursday morning, he received a voicemail from a local soil testing company confirming a scheduled appointment for the garden prep project at 191B. He called back immediately, demanding to know who had made the request. The technician hesitated, then said the order had been submitted online through a business account under the name Civic Earth Revitalization Program. It was a shell entity, likely created by someone within the committee to push through permits and bookings without scrutiny. Matthew notified his lawyer and added the new evidence to the file. Whoever was behind this was methodical, confident, and used to people backing down. They weren't just testing legal boundaries. They were acting as though the fight had already been won. And then came Karen. It was a Saturday afternoon, overcast and heavy with summer humidity, when she appeared unannounced. Matthew had just finished organizing equipment inside the barn when he heard the front gate unlatch. She walked in as if she had every right to be there, wearing a floral blouse and wide-brimmed hat, clipboard in hand, her expression perfectly neutral. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rao," she said as if she'd been invited. "I thought we might have a quick conversation about the property and your role in the greater community vision." Matthew didn't respond immediately. He waited, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Karen continued, undeterred. "There's been some confusion, I think, about what this land represents. It borders a residential zone, which is increasingly involved in sustainability efforts. You may not be part of the association formally, but you are geographically embedded, which creates a certain shared responsibility." "Responsibility to whom?" he asked, voice calm but cold. "To the community," she answered smoothly. "You see, the open spaces around here are being leveraged for wellness, biodiversity, and collective benefit. We've received multiple petitions from residents requesting the space be converted into something more productive and publicly accessible." "Your petition doesn't override my deed," Matthew said, "and productive means something different to me than it does to a group of people who've never stepped foot in this barn." Karen's smile didn't waver. "We're not trying to take anything from you, Mr. Rao. This is about inclusion, integration, evolution. You have an opportunity to participate in something larger than yourself." He stepped forward slowly, closing the distance. "You're standing on private land, uninvited. That's not inclusion. That's encroachment." Karen exhaled, her expression tightening just enough to reveal the underlying tension. "I was hoping we could come to an agreement informally. But, if that's not possible, the committee is prepared to escalate things through appropriate channels, and I want to be very clear, this isn't personal. It's about progress." Matthew didn't flinch. "Then I suggest your committee find another definition of progress. Because if you or anyone else steps foot here again without my consent, you won't like the outcome." Karen said nothing for a moment. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked back through the gate without another word. Matthew watched her leave, pulse steady, mind already moving 3 steps ahead. He knew that what had just happened wasn't a bluff. It was a warning. The groundwork had been laid, they'd framed the narrative. Now they were going to come for the barn in earnest, and he would be ready. By the time the next week rolled in, the quiet that had briefly returned to Matthew's property had given way to something heavier, something harder to name but impossible to ignore. It was the way the wind moved differently when he stepped outside at night, the absence of birdsong in the early morning, the unsettling feeling that someone had been near the barn even when every lock was sealed and every gate was chained. He had lived alone for years, and not once had he felt unsafe or out of place on his land. But now that certainty was eroding, not because of some clear, immediate threat, but because the pressure had changed shape. It had gone from direct confrontation to subtle interference, the kind of calculated persistence that works best in silence. It began with the inspection notice. A yellow slip, folded and left wedged in the hinges of the barn door, unsigned but stamped with a vague reference to environmental review standards. There was no letterhead, no agency listed, just a date and an implication that something had triggered a review of the property's ecological integrity. Matthew didn't even bother to call any offices to verify. He knew it wasn't official. This was a scare tactic, likely distributed by someone within the committee with access to template forms and a printer. But that didn't make it less effective. The point wasn't to enforce a law. The point was to make him react, to keep him just unsettled enough to waste his time. He didn't react, not the way they expected. Instead, he compiled every previous inspection his land had passed, every certificate of compliance, every exemption tied to the agricultural zoning designation he still retained. He photographed the entire perimeter of the property, documented the state of the barn inside and out, and created a time-stamped archive on an encrypted cloud server just in case. Paul, his attorney, advised him to stay passive, at least publicly. "They're not interested in escalation yet," Paul said. "They want you to step outside the line so they can paint you as unreasonable." But Matthew knew that game already, and he wasn't about to hand them a win. So when the next event occurred, a coordinated wellness walk that just happened to pass directly along the edge of his eastern fence, he said nothing. The group, about 20 people in pastel shirts and matching ball caps, strolled slowly along the line, pausing every so often to point at trees, take photos, or pretend to make notes on clipboards. One woman even knelt down beside the fence, reaching her arm beneath the bottom slat to take a sample of soil in a plastic bag. Matthew stood at a distance, arms crossed, watching them from his front porch. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched, stone-faced as they performed their little theater of concern. Later that afternoon, he reviewed the footage from the new motion-sensitive cameras he'd mounted discreetly along the fence posts. Each face was cataloged, each timestamp noted. He wasn't planning to report them, yet, but if there came a time when official documentation mattered, he'd have it ready. He knew how bureaucracies worked. No one ever won a land dispute by shouting. They won it by outlasting. That philosophy was tested sooner than he expected. 2 days later, a municipal truck pulled up just outside his property line. No logo on the door, no identification besides a magnetic placard that read Stormwater Division. 2 men got out and began laying down cones along the shoulder of the road. Matthew approached calmly, asked what the work order was. The older of the 2 said it was routine drainage maintenance, part of a scheduled easement preservation plan. When Matthew asked to see the work order itself, the man hesitated before admitting he didn't have a printed copy, only a reference. Number. He scribbled it down on the back of a receipt and handed it over with a forced smile. Matthew called the city the moment they left. No such plan existed. No such work order had been filed. And the reference number? It corresponded to a tree trimming request from 3 years prior, half a mile away. This wasn't just aggressive community meddling anymore. It was impersonation, unlawful, but hard to prove without catching someone in the act. Matthew logged the interaction, added it to the growing file, and doubled the motion capture radius on his perimeter cams. That night, someone slashed his garden hose and scattered a bag of mulch across the edge of his driveway. It wasn't enough to call the police, not technically, but it was enough to make a point. He replaced the hose, swept the driveway clean, and went back to work in the barn. He didn't flinch, But inside, something shifted. The feeling wasn't fear. It was clarity. They weren't going to stop. And so, the following week, Matthew changed tactics. He filed a formal complaint with the city's zoning commission. Not about his land, but about the adjacent development's unauthorized use of a municipal access path that ran through a public right-of-way near his fence line. The path had never been officially converted to residential use, yet the committee had constructed a decorative gate and paved the first 20 feet as part of their beautification initiative. Matthew cited safety concerns, incomplete permits, and obstruction of legacy easement access. His complaint forced the city to initiate a review of the committee's construction practices, a review that halted all landscaping activities in the area for 2 weeks. The response from Karen Bell was immediate and visible. The next time Matthew left his property to buy supplies, he returned to find someone had affixed laminated flyers to his gate, mailbox, and fence posts. The headline read, "Local Resident Blocks Community Wellness Path. Let's talk about it." Below it was a passive-aggressive essay about the importance of generosity in shared spaces, and how private landowners can be part of the solution instead of the problem. The flyers were unsigned, but the formatting matched the newsletter Karen distributed every quarter. Matthew removed the flyers and didn't mention them publicly. Instead, he updated the file. A few nights later, while checking the exterior camera feed, he noticed a figure standing near the barn, just outside the floodlight radius, not moving, barely visible behind the tall grass. He zoomed in, but the resolution was too low to make out a face. After several seconds, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing beyond the brush. He didn't sleep much that night. When he woke, there were fresh boot prints in the soft earth behind the barn. A shovel had been left leaning against the north wall. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. But someone had been digging. Shallow, small holes, like they were looking for something buried. Matthew documented the prints, the tool, the disturbed earth. Then he made a quiet decision. He began preparing for war, not in anger, but in resolve. He contacted a geospatial analyst he had worked with years ago and requested a new topographic survey of his land. He wanted proof of elevation changes, utility lines, and historical paths, everything that could be used to prove uninterrupted ownership and land use. He had aerial footage captured by drone, using legal flight zones, and began building a visual archive of the property from above. He installed reinforced locks on the barn doors and embedded pressure sensors into the gravel leading to the eastern entrance. Paul, when updated, said only one thing: "This is turning into a siege." Matthew agreed. But what they didn't know, what Karen hadn't calculated, was that Matthew wasn't an old man with a stubborn streak and a rusty shed. He was a systems thinker. He had spent a lifetime analyzing infrastructure, understanding how networks function and how they fail. He knew that when an organization overreaches, it leaves behind evidence. Breadcrumbs in the form of altered files, dubious permits, and unfiled plans. He didn't need to storm any meetings or scream at neighbors over fences. He only needed to collect, to prepare, and to hold. Because if they wanted to bulldoze his barn, they would have to run him over first. And before they could try, he was going to dismantle every inch of leverage they thought they had. Quietly, thoroughly, and without mercy. It was nearly 3 weeks after the soil testing voicemail that the first official city envelope finally arrived. Unlike the forged notes and photocopied flyers that had become common over the past month, this one bore the unmistakable weight of municipal bureaucracy. Embossed logo, registration stamp, and a numbered reference code across the bottom. Matthew opened it cautiously, bracing himself, but the content was not what he expected. It was a notification of complaint, filed not against him, but submitted in his defense. An anonymous party had triggered a formal review of the neighborhood committee's proposed Green Renewal Initiative, citing zoning violations, unlawful encroachment, and attempted seizure of non-residential property. The letter concluded that, in light of these claims, a temporary moratorium had been placed on all development activities relating to Parcel 191B and adjacent lots until further investigation could be completed. For a moment, Matthew simply stood in his kitchen holding the paper, blinking slowly. He hadn't filed this. He had no idea who had, and that unsettled him far more than it reassured him. Someone else was watching. Someone close enough to the process with enough knowledge and access had decided to intervene from within. His first call was to Paul. The attorney confirmed that neither he nor his firm had submitted the document and agreed the letter appeared authentic. "Looks like someone in the city's planning office finally decided to do their job," he said dryly. But Matthew wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He knew how city government worked. People didn't stick their necks out unless something had scared them into action. A few days later, his suspicion gained clarity. While scanning the city council's digital archives for updates on the case, Matthew found a video recording of the most recent zoning subcommittee meeting. Tucked into the last 10 minutes of a 3-hour session was a public comment made by a man named Leonard Shaw. The name meant nothing to him at first, but the voice was oddly familiar. Flat, methodical, with that deliberate pace that suggested discomfort in front of crowds. Leonard introduced himself as a surveyor contracted 5 years earlier to contribute to the original planning phase of the subdivision near Matthew's property. In his brief statement, he referenced irregularities in the placement of certain utility lines, inconsistencies in the committee's documentation of parcel boundaries, and an alarming degree of informality in the way changes had been approved, without full public record. Matthew watched the clip 3 times. Then he remembered where he'd seen that voice, or something like it. One of the soil walkers from the so-called wellness group had been wearing a reflective band vest. He hadn't been part of the clipboard crowd. He'd stayed back, quiet, mostly ignored. The face was partially obscured by sunglasses and a baseball cap, but the gait, the shape, the voice. Matthew was nearly certain it was the same man. Shaw had been there all along, not as a saboteur or an enabler, but perhaps as an observer, one who'd finally had enough. This new development shifted the tone of everything. Matthew was no longer alone, and the committee knew it. The pressure didn't stop, but it changed direction. The next flyer didn't accuse him of obstruction. It appealed to his willingness to compromise. It invited him to attend a closed-door session with Karen Bell and other stakeholders to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. Matthew declined. Instead, he had Paul send a letter demanding full public disclosure of all plans involving Parcel 191B and reminding the committee that any further engagement without legal mediation would be considered harassment. The response came not as a message, but as a move. One morning, Matthew walked out to find the eastern corner of his fence line missing. Not destroyed, not collapsed, just cleanly removed. 4 panels gone, posts sawed off just below the earth. No debris, no mess, nothing left behind but a temporary plastic mesh and a small laminated sign. Access path. Temporarily relocated. It was insulting not only because of the trespass but because of the arrogance behind it. The assumption that he wouldn't respond, that he wouldn't act decisively. He did. That same day, he hired a local contractor to install a set of 8-foot steel security posts at every boundary corner. The posts weren't decorative. They were heavy, reinforced and anchored in concrete, designed to signal permanence and legal intent. While the workers installed them, Matthew stood watch, arms crossed, his presence alone a challenge. Several neighbors passed by on the sidewalk, watching the operation with poorly concealed curiosity. One of them, a tall man with a Labrador and HOA branded windbreaker, paused and said, "You really think all this is necessary?" Matthew looked at him unsmiling. "You tell me." By sunset, the property looked more like a border checkpoint than a suburban lot, and Matthew didn't care. He wasn't preparing for violence. He was preparing for certainty. He wanted it clear to everyone, especially Karen, that every inch of land was accounted for and defended. The installation had an effect. Over the next week, there were no flyers, no uninvited visits, no new signs or false notices. The quiet returned, but it wasn't peace. It was withdrawal. Strategic, temporary, uneasy. Then, without warning, the committee made their play. They filed an official petition with the county to initiate an area character alignment review, a rarely used zoning provision that allowed a group of residents to request evaluation of a private parcel's compatibility with surrounding land use. If approved, it wouldn't grant them control, but it could trigger hearings, impose restrictions, and, more importantly, open a pathway for rezoning. It was a bureaucratic weapon, slow but dangerous, and Karen knew exactly how to wield it. Paul called as soon as the petition became public record. "They're trying to drown you in red tape," he said. "It won't hold, but it'll take time, and that's their goal. Delay, fatigue, attrition." Matthew didn't hesitate. "Then we cut them off at the knees." Over the next 48 hours, he and Paul assembled every document, every timestamp, every photo, every instance of trespass, forgery, and interference, and packaged them into a formal complaint not just to the zoning office, but to the County Ethics Board and the state's Ombudsman for Municipal Oversight. The complaint didn't focus on the land. It focused on abuse of process, misuse of public authority, and personal gain through procedural manipulation. Paul attached a request for expedited review, citing ongoing damages and threats to private property rights. It wasn't a counterpunch. It was a preemptive strike. And when Karen received her copy, hand-delivered by courier, she didn't respond. Not with another visit. Not with another sign. But for the first time in weeks, Matthew saw her walk past his gate. Alone. No clipboard, no smile. Eyes fixed straight ahead. There was no trace of satisfaction in her face, only calculation, quiet and incomplete. Matthew knew what it meant. They were regrouping, and the real fight hadn't even begun. When the petition hit the county office, triggering the area character alignment review, Matthew's world remained deceptively calm. The fence posts still gleamed under the sun, and the barn stood quiet and resolute at the center of his plot. But behind the veil of normalcy, something else was happening. The pressure had multiplied. The committee had shifted from passive-aggressive interference into structured procedural warfare, using regulations and legal mechanisms as weapons. They no longer needed to send flyers, trespass, or intimidate. The machinery of bureaucracy was now on their side. Unbeknownst to Matthew, this phase would require him to move faster than lawyers and louder than land surveys, using strategy and timing instead of brute force. On a crisp Tuesday morning, he awoke to an email from the zoning office, a notice that a site inspection was scheduled in 3 days. Unlike previous fabricated visits, this time it was official. A county-appointed inspector, traveling under state authority, would be there to evaluate Parcel 191B. The notice included instructions. Access must be granted for the duration of the visit. It was polite, neutral language, wrapped in the cold certainty of bureaucratic process. To refuse would be to invite sanctions. To comply could feel like a surrender of his hard-won defenses. He leaned back in his chair, coffee cooling on the table, and stared at the email. Who had authorized this review? It had to be triggered by the petition. He felt the gears of progress click into place within the committee's machinery. They had owned the bureaucratic moment, and now they forced the fight into formal terrain. He reached for his phone and dialed Paul first before the coffee could heat again. Paul confirmed the risk in calm detail. The inspection was routine on paper, but with the petition active, anything found could be cited in hearings and used to justify restrictions or even fines. On the record, they was trying to preserve community character and harmonization with adjacent property. But the implication was clear. If the barn showed any non-compliance, even minor, the committee could hold him to penalties, delays, or forced modifications. Paul's recommendation was firm. Play by their rules, but on your terms. Host the inspection, make it public. Show your compliance while documenting every part of their involvement. Engage a third-party specialist inspector to assess the same aspects. Do not concede anything outside of agreed scope. Matthew glanced at the barn windows, dusty but undamaged, then out toward the contractor's steel posts outside his fence. He realized this inspection could be the committee's trap. He would need to turn it into his advantage. He spent the next 2 days preparing meticulously. He arranged for an independent inspector to arrive ahead of the county official and evaluate roofing standards, foundation condition, electrical compliance, and drainage. All aspects that could be brought up during the review. He scheduled a local engineer to capture laser-level measurements of the foundation to compare against county records. He logged every date, time, and interaction on a spreadsheet designed neither to intimidate nor to upstage, but to record. On inspection day, he would have congruent file packets, one for the official inspector and an identical copy for his attorney. He would have the independent professional on hand for in-person comments. On the allowed morning, the inspector from the county arrived in a marked vehicle, ID badge clipped to his lapel. Behind him followed an assistant carrying a clipboard and a camera. Matthew met him at the gate wearing a pressed button-down shirt, steady demeanor, and a readiness that hinted at confidence, not confrontation. He greeted them courteously, offered bottled water, and began walking through the property, highlighting the solar panels, the rainwater reuse system, his engineered drainage plan, and the reinforced foundations. He pointed out his documentation bound in a portfolio, explaining each item as though narrating the unfolding scene. It wasn't a show. He believed in it. The barn wasn't just restored, it was optimized. Midway through the walkthrough, his independent inspector approached. She introduced herself to the county official, presented her documentation, and offered to demonstrate her measurement tools, politely asking to verify the slope and foundation tolerances. In front of the county inspector, she measured and annotated, explaining that all aspects fell within code, in some cases surpassing modern guidelines for repair and sustainability. The county inspector nodded quietly, taking notes and photos. Things were going smoothly. Too smoothly. As they neared the edge of the property, the independent inspector discovered something Matthew hadn't expected. An erosion channel running along the back fence line, previously masked by foliage. Water runoff had created a shallow trench. In the wrong hands, this could be cited as a flood hazard, or non-compliance with drainage code. The county official paused and asked about it. Matthew stepped forward. "We've observed this. I have engineered plans to rectify it with a low-impact swale and infiltration basin under review by the county." He reached into his portfolio and produced the PDF printed plan, including a civil engineer's stamp and timeline. "We intend to install it within the next month, subject to approval." The county inspector flipped through it slowly, then nodded and said, "We'll note that as future compliance." Matthew offered to email the digital version immediately, complete, with engineer's notes. The inspector took a photo of the signature page and accepted. The rest of the inspection passed without issue. The official left, thanking Matthew for his cooperation and thoroughness. The bond carefully established had paid off. Matthew had not only complied, but set the terms of compliance. He had framed the process, not the committee. He protected himself and turned their tool into his platform. By noon, he was drafting a press release, quietly, Friday afternoon timing, with the help of a local journalist friend who specialized in community affairs. The release focused not on confrontation, but on engagement. It spoke of the barn as a landholder's commitment to sustainable stewardship, and of a landowner working with official bodies to improve drainage and environmental resilience. He framed it as a cooperative narrative, not a defensive one. The aim, to shape public perception before hearings began. 3 days later, Karen Bell responded with a dismissive email to all committee members, stating Matthew had performed the bare minimum and requesting the continuation of the review and potential next steps. She CC'd a few members and a private legal consultant who advised the committee on permitting. Matthew was not alarmed. His team immediately replied, referencing the public record, inviting them to review the engineer's report and offering to present at the next review hearing with his independent inspector as a panelist. He wasn't requesting favor. He was offering transparency and professionalism in contrast to their political games. Then came the next move. A box arrived on his porch containing 3 soil core samples, each wrapped in plastic and labeled in handwritten script. Tested by Community Initiative Test, dated 2 weeks earlier. The cores matched areas of the barn's foundation. Matthew shared the samples with his engineer, who determined they had been taken hastily and without chain of custody, packaging damaged, retention unsuitable for legitimate testing. Essentially, gibberish. But the move had a purpose. It showed the lengths to which someone would go to manufacture evidence. He returned it with a note. Samples returned due to lack of professional accreditation. Please coordinate future requests through certified laboratories. Meanwhile, online rumor mills began churning. A local Facebook group lit up with questions from committee supporters. Is this barn a biohazard? What's really under that foundation? Is he just hiding things? The opportunity Matthew had created came into its own. The landings of fact, public process, and open transparency made it possible to push a narrative. He wasn't hiding anything. He was standing by documentation, inviting scrutiny. As the review hearing approached, Matthew held one final preparatory meeting with Paul and his engineer in the barn. They reviewed every point, prepared follow-up questions, rehearsed calm, confident statements, turnkey explanations of drainage changes, historic produce usage notes, barn preservation references. By the time the hearing date arrived, Matthew felt ready for the board, the committee, and any further petition, and he would stand as his own proof, audible, visual, factual, and prepared. The second escalation had been brutal, engineered not to intimidate, but to overtake. But Matthew had not only withstood it, he had mastered it. And now, in the tribunal's lecture hall, under the gaze of county officials, neighbors, and even curious passers-by, he would demonstrate that the barn didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to every rule, every record, and every principle he was willing to defend. The morning of the hearing, the sky was a dull slab of gray, not quite raining but swollen with the weight of coming weather, the kind that added pressure to everything it hovered over. Matthew dressed carefully, not to impress, but to project readiness. Neutral-toned collared shirt, steel gray jacket, leather notebook under his arm, each step thought through not out of vanity, but control. When he arrived at the municipal building, he was met with what he had anticipated but hoped to avoid. A small cluster of residents, some curious, others hostile, standing outside the hearing room doors. Their expressions varied, from skepticism to manufactured neutrality, and at the center stood Karen Bell, arms folded, her face a model of restrained confidence. She nodded at him when he approached, as though this were a routine neighborly disagreement, and not the result of weeks of targeted aggression, false notices, procedural exploitation, and quiet warfare carried out through planning boards and manipulated public process. Inside the room, the county review panel sat in elevated chairs behind a long desk, legal pads stacked before them, digital recorders already running. It wasn't a courtroom, but it had the tone of one. This wasn't just a planning matter anymore. It was a referendum on everything that had transpired since the first flags had been staked in his soil without consent. Matthew took his seat in the presenter's row, beside Paul and his independent inspector, while Karen and two other committee members occupied the opposite table, papers rustling with stage-managed energy. The room quieted as the chair of the panel opened proceedings, acknowledging the active petition, the review status, and the scope of their evaluation, not to determine personal merit or neighborhood preference, but to decide whether Parcel 191B required realignment with surrounding character and use. The language was bureaucratic, dispassionate, and intentionally sterile, but Matthew understood that behind each word was a potential shift in the future of his property rights. The committee spoke first. Karen began her remarks with a tone of false collegiality, referencing community engagement, shared vision, and public health. She cited a growing need for green infrastructure, claimed there was overwhelming neighborhood support for converting underutilized land into common space, and labeled Matthew's barn a non-compliant agricultural vestige, incompatible with the evolving ecological ethos of the residential district. Her words were polished, almost musical in cadence, but every sentence carried a subtle insult, a reframing of Matthew's independence as backwardness, his self-reliance as obstruction. She presented manipulated images of the barn, taken from odd angles to make it appear in disrepair, juxtaposed with design renders of flower beds and yoga pavilions, and referenced supposed complaints about noise, which had never been filed officially. Then came the counter. Paul began with documentation. He didn't argue emotion. He introduced permits, survey maps, compliance letters, third-party inspection reports, timestamps, photographs, sworn affidavits from contractors, and the drone footage archive. Each item was presented not with drama, but with precision, laying out the sequence of incursions, the falsified documents, the pattern of harassment. Matthew's inspector followed, speaking in calm technical language about soil integrity, runoff mitigation, and sustainability certifications that exceeded state standards. When it was Matthew's turn, he stood, not reading from notes, and spoke clearly. Not as a victim, not as an accuser, but as a man who had protected his property through official channels and expected only that the same rules applied to everyone. He explained that his barn was not an eyesore but a working structure maintained in accordance with code. He cited his investment in sustainable retrofits, the rainwater systems, the off-grid solar storage, the lack of noise violations or code breaches. He said plainly that what he built was not a threat to community, but a demonstration of how independence could coexist with responsibility. He did not plead. He did not attack. He simply held the panel's gaze and said, "My land is not a hypothetical. It is real, and I have defended it with real records, not imagined visions." The room was silent. The panel asked a few clarifying questions. Karen leaned forward to interject at one point but was stopped by the chair. The hearing continued with closing remarks, and then the panel withdrew to deliberate. It was over in an hour, but it felt like a year had passed. Matthew stepped outside to wait, his mind flat, steady, holding back speculation. When the panel returned, the chair read the verdict with the same neutral tone. The petition for realignment was denied. Parcel 191B remained compliant, and no further zoning review would proceed unless triggered by formal ordinance. The committee's actions were to be documented for procedural irregularities, and the county office would review any future proposals involving adjacent land for bias or incomplete representation. Matthew heard the decision, but it didn't hit him immediately. Only when Paul tapped his arm and muttered, "It's done," did the air in his lungs feel usable again. Karen rose slowly from her chair, her face still frozen in polite detachment, but her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her documents. For the first time, she offered no parting comment. She walked out stiffly, her silence louder than anything she might have said. As the hearing room emptied, several residents approached Matthew, not to congratulate, not exactly, but to nod, to murmur things like, glad it went fairly, or you handled it right. He knew better than to take that as support. It was not solidarity. It was recognition, the kind one gives to someone who survived something most people would have surrendered to long before. He didn't linger. He shook Paul's hand, thanked his inspector, and walked back to his truck, the sky still heavy but no longer threatening. For now, the land was safe. The barn stood. And those who had sought to erase it with polite language and silent pressure had been exposed by their own audacity. Weeks passed after the ruling, but Matthew didn't rush to celebrate. The land had always been quiet, but now that silence carried a different weight, neither heavy with dread nor brimming with relief, but marked by something closer to endurance. The barn stood unbothered, intact, its roof still humming softly as wind moved across the solar panels. The legal battles had ended, but the echoes of what had been attempted lingered. The space surrounding his property didn't feel victorious. It felt cleared, as though something unnatural had finally been extracted and now the ground could breathe again. He moved through his days deliberately, spending time in the workshop, repairing tools, reorganizing storage, patching fencing not from damage but for closure. Karen was gone, or at least gone in the ways that mattered. She had stepped down from her position on the committee 2 days after the decision. There had been no announcement, no newsletter tribute, no mention in neighborhood mailers. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. Someone else signed the seasonal update. Someone else sent out the list of community maintenance reminders. Her silence remained complete. No note, no confrontation, not even a thinly veiled return to the property under a new pretense. She had spent months building a siege around him, piece by piece, and when it failed, she vanished from the battlefield as if her campaign had never occurred. But Matthew knew better. He'd seen it too many times before, in the projects he'd once overseen, in meetings where architects and land managers pretended their failures were pivots, their manipulations reframed as early drafts. The silence after conflict wasn't always, oh, peace. Sometimes it was retreat. And while he didn't feel threatened anymore, he didn't feel restored either. What had been taken wasn't physical. It was trust, the fragile expectation that ownership meant autonomy, that a deed meant permanence. That illusion was gone. What remained was vigilance, and he didn't resent that. It just meant he'd learned what kind of neighborly smiles not to trust. The barn became something more than functional again. He didn't paint it or decorate it with aesthetic intentions. Instead, he began using part of the interior to document what had happened. Not publicly, not a museum. He had no interest in tours, but he created a system of binders, filed by date, complete with photos, affidavits, official letters, inspector reports, annotated maps, and a timeline that could be navigated by anyone willing to understand what resistance looked like when it was done properly. It wasn't for fame, it was for defense, for the next time, or the next person. No longer a man protecting his barn, Matthew had become something closer to a guardian of proof. One who understood that sometimes winning meant being too detailed to be destroyed. Occasionally, strangers would knock. Some were curious. Outsiders passing through the area who had heard fragments of the ordeal, pieced together from forums or city records. Others were quiet, serious, landowners from elsewhere, unsure how to stop something similar from happening to them. Matthew never turned them away. He didn't offer answers, just showed them where to start. He gave them copies of the checklist he'd built, tips on how to document, how to question politely, how to respond without escalation but without giving an inch. He shared the pattern. First, the friendly suggestion, then the quiet replacement of boundaries, then the sudden inevitability of something being taken. One afternoon, as he was finishing a structural check on the west-facing joists, a man pulled into his gravel lot. He looked out of place, not in clothing or vehicle, but in posture. He stepped out slowly, hands visible, scanning the barn, not in evaluation but almost reverence. When Matthew approached, the man introduced himself as a junior planner from a neighboring county. He'd read the case file as part of a training module and wanted to see the structure that had triggered so much paperwork. He asked if he could walk the edge of the property. Matthew agreed, shadowing him silently. After a while, the man turned and asked, "Did you ever think it would go that far?" Matthew considered the question. Then he answered, "It didn't go far. It went exactly where it was designed to go, if no one stops it." The planner nodded, absorbing the weight of that. He didn't stay long after that. When he left, he didn't ask for a photo. He didn't need one. That night, Matthew sat on the small bench he'd built years ago under the north tree line, where the last shadows of sunset passed over the roof of the barn before dark. The soil beneath his boots was still his. The structure behind him stood not because he had fought with rage, but because he had defended it with clarity. The battle hadn't changed him into something harder. It had simply made him visible, to the systems that underestimated him, to the neighbors who dismissed him, and, most importantly, to himself. The land was his. It always had been. But now it stood on more than just property lines. It stood on record.